The moment her hand connected with my face, the entire dining room went silent, and I remember thinking, very calmly, that this was the last time Diane Whitfield would ever touch me. 40 relatives sat frozen around that long cherrywood table in her lake house on Lake Norman, and not one of them said a word as the sting spread across my cheek. Her rings had cut a small line under my eye, and I watched a single drop of blood land on the white tablecloth she'd ironed herself that morning. She looked proud, like she'd finally done what she'd wanted to do since the day her son brought me home. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I picked up my napkin, pressed it to my cheek, and smiled at her, because I already knew something she didn't. 4 months earlier, I had quietly become the one person in that family holding every string that mattered, and she had just handed me, in front of every witness I would ever need, the exact excuse I'd been waiting for. That slap wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the end of 6 years of being told I wasn't good enough, wasn't from the right family, didn't deserve the man sitting beside me. What she didn't know, sitting there at the head of her perfect table, was that I had spent the last 4 months building something so quiet and so complete that by the time I was finished, she would lose her leverage, her lawyer, and the version of herself she'd spent 30 years polishing for everyone else to admire. But before I tell you what I did, you need to understand what she took from me first, because a woman like me doesn't burn her whole life down over one slap. She burns it down over 6 years of small cuts that never had the decency to heal. My name is Rachel Whitfield, I'm 42 years old, and I live just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, in a quiet neighborhood called Ballantyne. I run a small event planning company out of a converted garage studio behind my house, a business that started as a hobby after my daughter was born and turned into something that actually paid our mortgage. My husband, Daniel, is a project manager at Whitfield Construction, the company his late father built from nothing and that his mother, Diane, has run with an iron grip since his death 11 years ago. Daniel and I have 2 children, Emma, who's 9, and Jack, who just turned 6, and for most of our marriage, I told myself the coldness from my mother-in-law was just her personality, and that time would soften her. I was wrong about that for 6 long years, and if you've ever made excuses for someone who was quietly dismantling your life, I need you to know you're not foolish for hoping. You're just human. If you've ever been the outsider in your own family, the one who tried harder than anyone and still wasn't enough, subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories right now, because this channel exists for women exactly like you, and by the end of this story, you are going to feel justice. Stay with me, because what happens in the middle of this story is nothing compared to what I had already set in motion before that hand ever touched my face. Diane Whitfield never wanted me for her son. I learned that within the first month of dating Daniel, when she took me to lunch at a country club just to tell me, over a chicken salad she barely touched, that Daniel had always had a type, and that type was a woman named Whitney Caldwell, the daughter of Diane's oldest friend, with a trust fund and a pedigree stretching back 3 generations in this city. I was a nurse's daughter from a small town 2 hours away, raised by a single mother who cleaned houses to put me through community college, and Diane made sure I understood, in the gentlest, most surgical way possible, that I would never belong in the world she'd built. She smiled the entire time. That smile became the thing I feared most for the next 6 years, because it meant something cruel was coming wrapped in something that looked like kindness. When Daniel proposed, Diane didn't come to the engagement dinner. She sent a card. When we married at a small vineyard outside Asheville, she arrived 40 minutes late in a black dress, as though attending a funeral instead of her only son's wedding, and left before the cake was cut. When Emma was born, Diane visited the hospital for exactly 11 minutes and told me, on her way out, that I should really consider a nanny, because she didn't think I had the constitution for motherhood on top of running a little business. I remember standing there, still exhausted, holding my newborn daughter, and swallowing that comment whole. That was Diane's gift. She never gave you a reason big enough to justify a fight, only enough small ones to make you doubt whether you were allowed to be angry at all. For years, I told myself it didn't matter, because Daniel loved me and our children were happy. But Diane's coldness had a purpose I didn't fully understand until later. Whitfield Construction wasn't just Daniel's job. It was the only thing that connected him to the father he'd lost too young, and Diane used it like a leash. Every promotion came with a condition. Every raise came with a comment about how family businesses require sacrifice, which somehow always translated to Daniel working 60-hour weeks while she took 3 vacations a year to Palm Beach. Every time Daniel pushed back, asked for real ownership in the company his father built, Diane reminded him, gently, sweetly, devastatingly, that she could always bring in outside management if he wasn't cut out for the pressure. She never threatened him directly. She didn't need to. She had spent 30 years teaching her son that love was conditional, and I watched my husband shrink a little more every year trying to earn something that was never going to be freely given. The real shift happened 8 months before that slap, on a March afternoon, when I was dropping off paperwork at Daniel's office and overheard Diane on the phone through her half-open door. She was talking to her attorney, Gerald Boyce, about restructuring the company's ownership documents before her health became an issue nobody could plan around. I will never forget what she said next. "I don't want Rachel getting her hands on a single share of this company if something happens to me. Draft it so the moment that woman gets a foothold anywhere near this business, the trust reverts entirely to Whitney's family foundation." I stood in that hallway completely still, because I finally understood what 6 years of small cruelties had been building toward. Diane wasn't just cold. She was executing a plan to make sure I'd never have standing in the family my own children belonged to. That was the day I stopped being patient and started being strategic. I didn't tell Daniel yet, because I needed to understand how deep this went before anyone had the chance to cover their tracks. I spent the next several weeks quietly educating myself after everyone else was asleep, researching business structures and minority shareholder rights, and reaching out carefully to a corporate attorney 2 counties over named Patricia Alvarez, someone with no connection to Diane's social circle. What I learned changed everything. Whitfield Construction had taken out a business loan 11 years earlier, after Daniel's father died, and that loan had been restructured twice. Buried in the second restructuring was a private note held not by a bank but by an outside investment group that had since quietly sold portions of the debt on the secondary market. Someone out there owned a piece of paper that gave them real leverage over the company's finances, and Diane had never bothered to track who currently held it. That was the first small door I found in a wall she thought was solid. Here's my early win, the first move that told me I could actually do this. I used savings from my own business, money Diane didn't even know existed, and partnered quietly with Patricia to begin acquiring pieces of that outstanding note through a private holding entity with a name that meant nothing to anyone in Charlotte. It took 4 months and nearly everything I'd saved, but by early November, I held enough of that debt to trigger a mandatory review clause the moment I chose to call it in. Diane, the woman who told me I wasn't cut out for anything beyond decorating cakes, had no idea her daughter-in-law now held real leverage over the paper that kept her company breathing. I remember signing the final transfer documents alone in my garage studio at 11 at night, and for the first time in 6 years, I didn't feel small. But there was something even bigger waiting underneath all of this, something I hadn't found yet, and when I get there, you'll understand why the slap was the least important thing that happened that Christmas. Thanksgiving came before I was fully ready, and Diane, sensing nothing of what was coming, decided that year to make a spectacle of putting me in my place, as if she could feel her power slipping and needed to reassert it. 40 relatives gathered at her lake house, including Daniel's sister Melissa, who had always been kind to me in private but too afraid of her mother to be kind to me in public. Diane waited until every fork had food on it, then raised her wine glass and announced, loudly enough for the whole room, a toast to a real family, to blood and legacy, before looking directly at me and saying that some people simply marry into things they were never meant to inherit. A few relatives laughed nervously. I stood up, calmly, and said I thought it was important, on a holiday about gratitude, to be honest about what people actually contribute to a family, and that I was grateful every day for building something of my own instead of waiting for anyone to hand me anything. Diane's face went white, then red, and before I understood what was happening, her hand came across the table and struck my cheek so hard my ear rang for nearly a minute afterward. The room went completely silent. Melissa was the first to move, standing up so fast her chair fell backward, saying her mother's name in a voice I'd never heard from her before. Daniel finally stood up, and for the first time in 6 years, he didn't apologize for his mother's behavior. He simply said, quietly, "We're leaving," and took my hand. As we walked out, I felt something Diane couldn't see. I felt the last piece of my plan click into place, because now I had 40 witnesses, several who would later swear statements to what they saw, and a husband who had finally chosen, in public, to stand beside me instead of beside her. That night, in our kitchen, with ice on my cheek and our children finally asleep upstairs, I told Daniel everything. I told him about the phone call I'd overheard 8 months earlier, about the trust documents designed to erase me the moment anything happened to his mother, about the debt I had spent 4 months quietly acquiring. I watched my husband's face shift from grief to disbelief to something I can only describe as awakening, like a man finally seeing the shape of the cage he'd been living in his entire adult life. He didn't get angry at me for keeping secrets. He understood immediately why I had, because he understood, better than anyone, exactly what his mother was capable of when she felt threatened. That night, we became partners in something neither of us had ever done before. We became a team against her. But there was something I hadn't shared with Daniel yet, something Patricia discovered 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, buried in the transaction history of that debt. The investment group that had purchased Whitfield Construction's restructured loan 9 years ago wasn't some anonymous entity. It had been quietly funded, through 2 shell layers, by Gerald Boyce's own family trust, the very attorney Diane trusted with everything. Her own lawyer had held private leverage over her company for nearly a decade, likely as insurance for himself, and by acquiring pieces of that debt myself, I had stepped into a chess game that had been running silently between 2 people who thought they were the only ones who understood how the pieces moved. Diane had been vulnerable this entire time and had simply never known where to look. The weeks after Thanksgiving were not peaceful. Diane called Daniel every day, alternating between icy silence and tearful apologies that always somehow ended with her explaining why I had provoked her. She tried, at one point, to convince Daniel that I had orchestrated the entire scene to embarrass her in front of the family, a claim so absurd that even Melissa laughed out loud when she heard it. Then Diane escalated, calling Daniel's office and threatening to reduce his role at the company, reminding him that ownership decisions were entirely hers to make. That threat, the same one she'd used for 11 years to keep her son compliant, no longer carried the weight it used to, because Daniel now knew what I knew. His mother's grip on that company was built on a foundation she didn't fully control. Every time she tried to tighten the leash that December, Daniel simply said, calmly, "We'll talk about it at Christmas," and I watched him become, for the first time in his life, a man his mother could no longer predict. There's a moment I have to tell you about from mid-December, the second crisis of that month, the one that almost derailed everything. Diane, sensing something had shifted, picked Emma and Jack up from school without asking us first, and didn't return them until nearly 9 that night, 3 hours past when she'd promised. When Daniel called, frantic, she told him, sweetly, she simply wanted quality time with her grandchildren, as though she hadn't just shown us exactly how much power she still believed she had. That night, once the kids were safely home, Daniel and I sat at our kitchen table until 2 in the morning finalizing what we were going to do, because we understood now that Diane wasn't simply cruel. She was dangerous, and she needed to understand, completely and permanently, that her control over this family was over. We decided Christmas Eve would be the moment. Diane always hosted a large family dinner that night, the one holiday she took more seriously than any other, because it was the anniversary of the week she and Daniel's father had opened Whitfield Construction's very first office, back when it was nothing more than a folding table and 2 phone lines. Diane loved to use that dinner to remind everyone of her legacy, her sacrifice, her singular importance to everything the family had. This year, she had no idea that legacy was about to be handed back to her in pieces. I want to tell you the full plan we built, because I think you'll appreciate the precision of it. Patricia had prepared all the necessary documentation to formally exercise the mandatory review clause on the debt I now controlled, a clause that, once triggered, required an immediate audit of Whitfield Construction's financial structure and gave the holder, meaning me, the legal right to request a restructuring of ownership terms if the company couldn't meet updated repayment conditions within 30 days. Given the company's current cash position, which Daniel had quietly confirmed over the previous weeks, meeting those conditions without renegotiating equity was simply impossible. Separately, Patricia had also compiled clear documentation, through public corporate filings, showing Gerald Boyce's decade-long undisclosed conflict of interest, information that, once shared with the state bar and with Diane herself, would end his ability to represent her, or anyone, ever again. And finally, Daniel had spent the past month quietly gathering signed statements, unprompted, from Melissa and 3 other relatives who had witnessed either the Thanksgiving assault or years of documented cruelty toward me. Statements Patricia said would matter enormously if Diane ever attempted the legal route Daniel and I both suspected she'd eventually try. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, and the dining room looked exactly as it had on Thanksgiving, cherrywood table gleaming, 20 places set, the same white tablecloth, though this time there was no blood on it yet. Diane stood at the head of the table in a deep red dress, raising her glass again, ready to deliver another toast about legacy and blood, and I watched her scan the room for me, perhaps expecting fear, perhaps expecting an apology. Instead, I stood up before she could speak, and I asked if I could say something first, since it was, after all, the anniversary of the company that had brought this family everything it had. She smiled, thinking I was finally showing her the deference she believed she deserved. She had no idea what was coming. I told the room, calmly, that I had recently learned something important about the history of Whitfield construction, something I thought everyone deserved to know on this particular anniversary. I explained, in plain language anyone at that table could understand, that a private investment group had held significant leverage over the company for nearly a decade, that this leverage had recently changed hands, and that the new holder of that leverage was standing in the room with them right now. I watched confusion ripple across the table before I said the next part. I told them that the attorney who had quietly arranged that leverage in the first place, the same man Diane had trusted with every legal decision for over 10 years, was Gerald Boyce, and that documentation proving his conflict of interest had already been filed with the appropriate state authorities that morning. Diane's wine glass slipped slightly in her hand. Gerald, seated 3 chairs down, went the color of the tablecloth. Then I told them the last part, the part that mattered most. I said that as the current holder of that debt, I had already exercised my legal right to request a full financial review of the company, that the review would almost certainly require a restructuring of ownership within the next 30 days, and that I intended, along with Daniel, to ensure that restructuring finally reflected what should have been true from the very beginning, that Daniel, who had built this company back up with his own hands for 11 years without ever once being given real ownership or real respect, would finally receive both. Diane stood up so fast her chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor, and she demanded to know how any of this was possible, her voice cracking in a way I had genuinely never heard before. I told her the truth, simply and without cruelty, because I didn't need cruelty anymore. I told her that 6 years of being called unworthy had taught me exactly how to become someone she could never underestimate again, and that everything I had built over these past months, I had built quietly, patiently, and entirely within the boundaries of the law, the same way she had once tried to erase me from her son's future. What happened next is the part of this story I still think about most. Melissa stood up beside me. Then 3 other relatives stood as well, the same ones who had signed statements weeks earlier, and one by one, they said they had watched Diane humiliate me for years and had simply been too afraid to say anything out loud until now. Diane looked around that table, searching for a single face that would defend her, and found none. Not one person at that table, not even her own sister, stepped forward to speak on her behalf. Daniel walked over and stood beside me, took my hand in front of everyone, and told his mother, in a voice steadier than I had ever heard from him, that he loved her, that he always would, but that he would no longer allow her to use fear as a substitute for love in this family, and that starting in the new year, he would be taking his rightful, equal role in the company his father built, with me standing beside him as an equal partner in every decision that affected our family's future. Diane didn't scream. She didn't cry, not right away. She simply stood there, in her deep red dress, at the head of a table full of people who had finally stopped being afraid of her, and I watched 30 years of carefully maintained control collapse in complete silence. Within a month, the company's ownership structure was formally restructured under Patricia's guidance, giving Daniel a controlling equity stake he had earned a decade ago and never received, with reasonable protections built in for Diane's continued financial security, because despite everything, we weren't interested in cruelty, only in fairness. Gerald Boyce lost his license within the year once the state bar completed its investigation. And Diane, for the first time since I'd known her, began attending family dinners as a guest rather than as a monarch, quiet, humbled, and, slowly, over many months, something that almost resembled kind. I think about that Christmas Eve often, not because of the moment Diane's face went pale, though I won't pretend that didn't feel like justice finally arriving after 6 long years. I think about it because of what came after, the first real Easter dinner we had as a family where nobody flinched when I spoke, where my children sat at a table that finally felt safe for them, where my husband looked at me like a partner instead of someone he had to protect me from his own mother. If you've ever been made to feel small in your own family, if you've ever been told, in ways loud or quiet, that you didn't belong, I want you to know that patience and precision can accomplish more than anger ever could. Before I go, I need you to subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories, because there are so many more stories like mine waiting to be told, women who waited, who planned, who finally took back what was theirs without ever raising their voice. Leave a comment and tell me what lesson you took from this story, or how you would have handled a woman like Diane Whitfield in your own life, because I promise you, someone reading this needs to hear that they aren't crazy, they aren't overreacting, and they are not alone. Some of the quietest revenge takes 6 years to plan and 30 seconds to deliver, and I would do every single one of those 6 years again, just to watch my husband finally stand up at that table and choose me.